Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. As always, I'm your host, Arif, and I'm joined by
myself, Tika, your afternoon or morning co-host.
Depending on the time of day, isn't it?
Depending on where you listen
exactly,
to it, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode. So, kind of went viral this week, but in the news, we had the announcement from Samsung that they're going to enforce a 6-day working week for their executives.
Woohoo.
I don't know if you heard this news, TK.
I did hear this news, and I was looking as what the hell?
Yeah, well, exactly. That was the reaction across the board. The quote was, the direct reason for this was to inject a sense of crisis amongst workers. They have been suffering financially for some time. And as a result of that, the board has decided that they want to try this 6-day working week. That's the news that we've had. And as I said, it's gone viral. People are talking about it. And it's interesting because obviously we're in this period where countries and other organizations are looking to embrace a 4-day working week. So there's something going on here. Obviously the people are experimenting with shorter weeks, and Samsung are thinking, no, actually we need to extend the working week.
Yes, and it's quite interesting. I think what I find interesting here is obviously South Korea, but not obviously, but people far in Asia. I think in Japan there's like a word for dying of overwork. I will not try to pronounce it. So theoretically, I'm not surprised by the demand that they're placing, and by the way, on their executives, as you say. So there you go. Second of all, it's an interesting example of leading by example. Although, is this the example you want to give? I'm not surprised that it happens in this particular work culture. But do I agree with it? Well, not necessarily.
Yeah. So that's the conversation I want to have today, which is, are they going the wrong way? And perhaps, I think more importantly, are there deeper issues at play here? That's what I want to explore. And I know you've mentioned something there culturally. We may come on to that, but there may be some more deeper psychological things. Leave some of that to the imagination. Let's come back to that. So there we go. That's the topic we'll explore for today's episode, and I'm excited to discuss it as always, TK. I think as a starting point, let's just focus on this 6-day working week, 4-day working week conversation.
Working time, yes.
Exactly. and as I mentioned, we've got countries around the world who have been experimenting with some of this. In fact, not all of it is completely new. Some of it has been going on for some time. For instance, I was looking at some of the reading I was doing. France implemented a reduction of working hours almost 20 years ago to create a better working life balance for the whole nation.
That's cool. Yeah.
Now, that's 20 years. That's been a long time. There's always this, stereotypical view of French working life being not very productive, isn't it? I can speak to that for the listeners of our regular series. You may remember I mentioned working in France many years ago, that's an interesting one, and so that shows how culturally, like you mentioned, there are differing interpretations of productivity, work-life balance, right? But there is this trend now. So that was 20 years ago, but we're back here to 2024. Over the last couple of years, there is now a growing movement to look at promoting better work-life balance, and therefore looking at whether the working week should be less. I don't know. Initial thoughts on all of this, TK. Where do you think what's going on?
It might be a bit of a tangent, to be honest. Unfortunately, right? But I am not that I'm baffled, but I think this is the wrong conversation to have always about the working time, because why the hell am I measuring people's input? I mean, as if you're doing factory work, I understand that it's proportional to your output. So yeah, there's a shift. But for knowledge work, and I guess this is what we're talking about here with executives, Um, yeah, I just feel that this is a wrong conversation, and somehow, again, and I think we had this conversation before about pitting employees versus
Yeah.
employers. With return to office, etc., all this jazz.
Yeah.
Um, it's just yeah. I will force you to stay at work for 4, 5, 6 days, that many hours, and you're imprisoned in that, and that's the way we have our social and employment contract arranged like this. But obviously, you can slack off, you can be productive, you can expend as much energy as you want as an employee. We all know that. What's the point, right? And why we're having the conversation about 5 and 6 day weeks. What is interesting is how do we help people both find the right balance in terms of work-life
Mm.
balance and compared with productivity,
Mm.
right? How do we strike the right social, economical, and productivity balance here? That's the interesting conversation, I think.
You're right. I think you're definitely making a point. And what I think is interesting, I know you mentioned why we're having this conversation, fair challenge, but just going back a little bit and getting our listeners up to speed. UK, a bunch of companies here in the UK
Hmm.
performed a 4-day week trial pilot program.
Yes, yes.
This is over a year ago now, actually, so it's very recent. They did a study with over 60 companies taking part, so a fairly decent proportion.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
and if you look at the results, it's impressive. I mean, almost every company, so 92% that took part decided to continue with the trial after this pilot testing phase. So that tells you something that, how these businesses or how these organizations view what you're talking about there, productivity, from the lens of, time, right? And I
Yeah.
think it tells us that, there are questions, I suppose, to be raised about the traditional view of 5 days, or in Samsung's case, is it 6 days? That the longer time you spend doing the work, the more productive you be. That's the challenge this is really focused on, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but I think it might be two different things a
Okay.
bit. One is what they. Okay, I'm not using this analogy, but there's a great saying in the American Armed
Oh yeah.
Forces. I can't do the proper American accent, sorry.
Don't
But
try it.
what they say is, well, I'm not even trying. What they say, if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid,
Ah.
or it ain't stupid. But what I wanted to say there is, well, it works, so it works, right? Do it. The second thing I will say is it's the same thing with remote work. Oh, the remote work would never work for us. Boom, 2020 came in, people were forced, and suddenly it works. So that's antiquated views, and that's that. But I think with Samsung, it might be something a bit different, which is how do you increase a sense of urgency? I don't know if people working 6 days a week will actually increase a sense of urgency and inject a sense of crisis because they have to sit Saturdays in the office or whatever. If they sit Sundays or not Saturdays, it doesn't really matter. So that. There is a lot of interesting things going on, which maybe not always make sense.
No, exactly. It doesn't. And I think there's something you touched on earlier, which I want to come back to, and I think we'll expand probably in the second half of this episode as well,
Yeah.
a bit more, which is knowledge work, right? And
Hmm.
so there is a conversation to be had here, I think, about the connection between knowledge work productivity. Okay, so
Yeah, that's an
this
interesting
is
topic.
exactly so we know, and from our work and the experience of what we do, TK, coming from this agile leadership background, knowledge work is inherently nebulous, right? There are a lot of unknowns, untangibles, and uncertainties, right, that make up this type of work. So how do you apply this traditional productivity type measure to that type of work? It's a bit apples and pears. That's what I'm thinking, because you know this idea of productivity is a hangover, I would say, from industrial revolution,
Oh, absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And so now we've got a completely different way of work, predominantly taking place. Let's just say we could argue from I don't like using developed, underdeveloped as a terminology, but let's say Western economies, okay,
Hmm.
or Western-like economies, if we can say it like that. That is the predominant type of work that's going on. So now, and we're using these measures that may not be fully applicable for a type of work that is hard to really quantify.
Well, it's hard to quantify, Arif, right? If you okay, so you can there's many different ways you can quantify work. Time is what you would quantify through using
Mm,
input. How much time and material and resources used correctly, which is like the time of your, I don't know, shovel. Um, you can possibly quantify output. If you're if there's a famous case. Sometimes I read Polish papers about someone on their probation period being sacked because they haven't they were nastily sacked through Skype
oh
because
gosh.
a graphic designer did not complete enough um, graphical designs in a day, and it's all silly. So that's output, but it's also outcome, right? So an interesting thing is we are talking about, like, for instance, for salespeople, they are a lot of times outcome focused, which is like, okay, there is a sales target for you, go and get it, I don't care. And you will possibly be compensated through that. Now many people say, oh, no, that's not why I'm employed, so I want to have the job security, and you're supposed to pay me no matter what, right? Yeah, this is why we just agree, okay, well, you will be available at this particular time, input, and I will pay you no matter what. That's the social contract of employment.
Mm,
And we're getting into dangerous territories of me questioning employment and people's job securities. But my views are a bit on the side of like, oh, that's not a contract I'm happy
yeah.
with, so I'm not employed.
Yeah, no, I get it. Interesting. On this point of time, some other
Yeah.
reading I was doing. So, this writer named Madeline Daw.
Mhm.
This was some reflection she was giving on this topic of productivity as part of another podcast. But I was just reading through it and reading her reflections, and it was interesting because she was making this observation that where we are now, modern life, modern work, we have so many ways to optimize how we use our time, right? So
Yeah.
whether it's devices, apps we use, calendars on our phones, the whole lot.
Well, it's called we're more productive, right? These tools make us more
Well,
productive, like a plow. Oh,
this is
well,
the
go
point,
ahead.
right? So that they're designed
Should
obviously
be.
to make you more, as in to save or optimize use of time, so that we can use that spare time for other things, right? Now,
Yes.
then we use
Or
that
to do more, right?
Sorry.
Or to achieve more, to get more
Right.
results,
Now, some
theoretically.
people might use it to then hopefully do things with their lives, connect with each other,
Yes.
spend time with friends or with family or whatever. And then what's happening is in her view, her observations are that people then instead start feeling guilty about time they're wasting because I'm not doing something so-called productive, whatever that productive thing is.
Oh, the cult of productivity. That's an
There you
interesting
go.
one, yeah.
So there's this cultish thing. Oh, well, because everyone else is, and you look at this whole, you could
Yeah,
argue,
especially in social media, everyone's so
right,
productive.
there you go. Social media, we could look at how the TikTok kind of whole,
TK is going live every
right.
day. Oh my God, I'm not. Ah,
And there's that FOMO, oh, TK's not there live. We haven't
yeah,
produced the
I want to
latest
be a TK.
podcast episode. There's this whole conversation going on here. And I think it's fascinating. We're opening this bubble. And she's reflecting on it in a really interesting way. And I think some of that is also partly maybe going back to what I said earlier, this shift from traditional work to more knowledge-based work, and how we apply this lens or maybe historical lens, if that's the way of saying it, of productivity, right? So there's something there. I think that's a really interesting thing to consider, and maybe also, uh, yeah, I don't know. Is it she? In her view, she's thinking it's more about creativity. That's the real thing that we should be measuring. It's not that productivity side of things. It's a bit cultish, like we said, but it's actually the creativity that we should measure instead. That's her view. Is
And
it?
what if you're not creative? What if you find it hard to be creative?
Yeah.
What if you have a type of personality that's just a doer, right? You're very diligent. Your job is just, you can really focus and get a lot of stuff done. And some people are like, willy-nilly, messy desk, and I'm so creative. I think the creativity isn't necessarily just an answer, right? We all contribute differently, don't we?
Exactly. That may not be the answer, but I think, and it could be different for different people. I get your point. But at the very minimum, I think needs to be this recognition that in this type of work, as we call it, knowledge work or creative work, however you want to describe it, it is going to be very different. People, if you want to describe it, people are creative, if you want to describe it that, in different ways, or productive, if that's the word label we want to use, in very different ways. Some people
contributing in different ways,
exactly. Right? So
talented.
So trying to use a single measure for all of that, I think, is the issue and the challenge. And so if we circle back to the start of this conversation, and we're looking at the working week, right? And there's a whole movement to redefine it. It clearly looks like there are movements to redefine it in different ways. So just some more insights on that, which is really interesting. And you mentioned South Korea, right? So last year, right? This is March last year. Forget 4-day week. Some legislators were proposing to allow overtime to be maximized up to 69 hours. So workers could then voluntarily, work up to 69 hours extra of overtime in a week, which is I just can't, like, mathematically. What do you do with too much?
Well, if you're like 18 years old, full of energy, but okay, mathematically it's silly, yes, or human beings, unless we're talking about AIs or some kind of aliens. But Arif, may I suggest, also looking at it from a different point of view, right?
Yes.
4-day weeks, 8-day weeks. Well, there's the gig economy.
Oh, yes.
You can click the app and, be working or not working. There's full freedom, right?
Yeah.
And look what happens. Look at our streets. Look how these poor people are being exploited. Look who's there. People from underrepresented, not privileged minorities. I can't see, a Oxford student after classics delivering, Volt and Uber Eats and whatnot. This is obviously, when you go the other way, look what happens, right? So there's no single ideal answer. No. It's difficult to find the balance here. I know it's a cop-out to say that, but it's like, well, you can work a lot, as you've demonstrated, like through this case, that, legally, yes, you can. And through gig economy, of course, you can work yourself to death. And unfortunately, you won't earn that much because usually you're forced to work this way. On the other hand, you've got the 4-day week. So, oh man, the world isn't fair, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not great. But that's the world we're in, unfortunately, and we have to find ways to, make things better for ourselves, for all of us.
So I postulate the following things, right? I would say that what we need to do is we need to have a conversation. We're having it now, actually, but I mean publicly, as a especially in modern high-income service-based economies. This is what I will use instead of your Western world.
Thank you, GK.
To think about what's the balance we want to have in our society between productivity itself and work-life balance. What's the model of life we want to have? If the wonderful people in South Korea believe that they want to live like this, and this is their choice, they culturally believe that this is the fulfillment of their life, which it might be, right? I'm not discriminating it. So be it. If people in Norway or Sweden believe to live a different life, or people, for instance, in certain parts of Africa, obviously a different culture, live the way you want, right? There's obviously economy and, the general wealth and income of a country, and the fact that productivity is measured by your effort multiplied by capital, right? So the richer your environment is, the more resources, and I don't mean people, you have at your disposal, the more GDP you can generate. Right. So, if people in Korea want to do that, if they like it in Samsung, and, it's obviously a staple company for South Korea, hey, that's what it is. But in our, for instance, neck of the woods, we might find that this is not the societal model we want, right? So that's important. what is it that you want as a society?
Yeah,
but not everyone has a chance to move where they want
of
to.
course.
So there you go.
That's a valid argument, I think. I totally hear where you're coming from, TK. That's a valid argument in terms of culturally, who are we, of course, to decide or opine on whether that's good or bad or otherwise. I'm not sure that's the conversation I'm trying to have, but no, I take.
Sorry, as always.
No, I take the point.
Spun off.
Take the point entirely. I think it's just interesting to understand and compare perceptions and understandings of what productivity means, and
yes, that's quite
and
true.
debate that. I think that's the important thing to do. But okay, on that point, I'll tell you what. Let's go for a break. Come back, because I think we're going to go into something a bit more deeper.
Yeah, because we'll get more productive.
Exactly. We'll see you after the break. Thank you. Did you know you can follow us on YouTube? Simply search for Humble Associates to find recordings of all of our latest webinars and much more. And if you're looking for a 5-minute burst of daily leadership wisdom, why not follow TK's Coach on the Rocks playlist, a soothing, insightful series designed to uplift your leadership habits. Subscribe today. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we were discussing varying levels of understanding of what productivity means and working weeks across the world and how different they are. And I mentioned we wanted to go into something a bit more deeper. So let's do that. One of the things I was looking at, TK, and I'm trying to understand when thinking about, going back to Samsung and where we started the episode, i.e., execs being asked to work much longer, was this idea of actually working longer. Where does it come from? Why is there this desire that, or belief perhaps, that working longer means better results, better outcomes, whatever, better value delivered, whatever it might mean, right? And putting the cultural aspect aside for a moment, it's just the idea of long hours. I wanted to go into that, and I came across some really fascinating research. And I came across some very fascinating research by a lady named Professor Laura Empson, who is or was part of London's Cass Business School. She's also a professor at Bayes Business School in London, and she does other research work at Harvard, Cambridge, etc. So she's very experienced and knowledgeable in this whole field of understanding working lives, leadership, etc. And her main research has been about what she defines as insecure overachievers. Now, have you heard of this term before?
Well,
prior to today.
No. I've heard it before, and I think I've even mentioned it. Yeah, that's a very important topic and a very, oh man, I'm just so many stories and unfortunately hardship in my life and people I worked with, unfortunately caused by this phenomenon. But do go on.
Okay, well,
I'm just
let's
PTSD, right?
Yeah, let's come back to that maybe if you want to share a bit more. But so what is this all about? What is this insecure overachiever phenomenon, right? And in her research, she's written a book as well. And what she came across was after doing hundreds and hundreds of interviews of leaders, execs, and others, and employees, a pattern where there are professionals, and this phenomenon typically appears in the professional services industry, right? So investment banking, law firms, accountancies, consultancies, etc., where there's a client-facing element especially, but I think there's a lot to be learned either way. And this, what she's found is that these are a type of worker who are really capable, exceptionally capable, very smart people, very ambitious, but they are driven by a profound belief in their own inadequacy, i.e. they just inherently don't believe in themselves enough or believe that they're capable people, even though they're really smart. It's a really interesting dichotomy that they operate within. And so she's labeled them as insecure overachievers, because they do exceptional work, sorry, but there is a inherent insecurity in themselves about who they are and what have you. So where does this come from? How has this appeared? How is this kind of manifested itself? We'll talk about some of that. But what's interesting is she identified that some of this comes from childhood and how, unfortunately, your upbringing may have had an impact in how you perceive the world. So she describes that, some children grow up believing that they are only noticed and valued by their parents when they are excelling or doing above expected. And then because of that belief, that persists over a long period of time, even after they've left home, because they've kind of internalized that insecurity. Like, okay, I can only be good if I show beyond what I'm capable of doing, right? That kind of belief. So it was quite tough reading some of this and trying to imagine. And then I started realizing or looking back in my own career where I've worked in consultancy firms, and it actually makes sense. In some cases, I remember being part of teams or working with individuals who, I remember in my graduate program at the beginning, I was at a consultancy firm, and there was some who would do anything and stay long hours, and they would, some of the team members I was with, really try more than others to get approval and win over senior managers and that kind of stuff. They really valued that validation in order for them to feel, you know what, I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing good at my job, and I will be accepted here, and my job is secure. And I can recall some of that. And I don't know what thoughts you have on all of this, TK, but yeah,
lots of
go
thoughts.
for it.
So obviously, many people the train of thought that you just described, right? What this person might think. It's perfectly logical, isn't it? Right? You're young. You have the energy and the ability to work extra hard and hours and so on. Obviously, it gets more difficult with age, but in the beginning stages of career, it's a bit easier. I'm not definitely saying for everyone, but I remember myself being young. Second of all, obviously we want to be accepted, praised, and do well, right? It's
human nature.
It's on a basic human nature that we want to be highly valued members of our group.
Definitely.
It's very primal, really. So that's that. And in these organizations, as we know, there's the classic consultant firms get these young associates in, and they, unfortunately, through their youth and energy, have to carry a large load of not manual labor, but they do a lot of work, these poor young people. And, that's unfortunate. Whereas the more senior people don't have to work just like that. And they're using very clever incentives like up and out and stuff like that. And, I'm sure if you've worked or know someone that works in this competition, highly competitive. So essentially, the whole environment is constructed in such a way. The young people know that what they're getting into, they're doing it. And I know some people that went through that. I just said, I just wanted to have it in CV, one of these big four companies. So that happens, right? But the insecurity is the difficult part, because consultants are supposed to be, and working in consulting, we know, trusted advisors, right? I always give the analogy of whatever Angus Dumbledore or whatever Dumbledore's name is, or Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I guess these young associates don't necessarily look like that. And I don't mean the length for their beards, but I actually do mean the length of their beards, right?
The life experience,
so it might be, So it might be a bit of a challenge seeing yourself as a trusted advisor when you've just graduated, and people are talking about stuff that you might not always have the experience in. So insecurity will play into that.
And it's interesting reading through Professor Laura's work and what she's uncovered. We mentioned earlier on knowledge work, right? We talked about that in the first half. And it comes back again here as well, which is interesting. And she says that in all the research she did and all the interviews that she conducted, hundreds of interviews, it was the this insecurity, she believes, is rooted in what she defines as the inherent intangibility of knowledge work. So there's this belief, is what she's found, is that these individuals, these workers, leaders as well, many of these are leaders actually, who think that, okay, well, how do I convince my client that I know something worthwhile to justify the high fees that I'm charging? Exactly to your point, right?
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Such a huge problem. No, I'm sorry to be laughing at her research, which is obviously true and so intuitively true. But hey, this is how, unfortunately, we've managed to work with these consulting companies. I have to say, for the love of me, it's probably because no one gets fired because they use the Big Four. The big people in the Big Four said it's going to be okay, so they get the large fees.
And so then that creates this mental, overload and pressure on especially a lot of these young employees. But also I think it also applies to leaders as well, which is, okay, we've got to prove ourselves. We've got to convince that we are worthwhile being here. We know our stuff, and so what happens as a result of that is this overwork happens, right? This idea we work longer hours because I need to seek the validation. I need to make sure my manager is seeing what I'm doing and is happy with my work. And so that's the only way I can feel stable. But then even then, it's like a never-ending cycle because they're in this vicious loop now, death loop. They can never come out of it effectively because it's like, okay, so I've worked an extra 10 hours. I've done all this good stuff. Is it enough? Is he going to still, or do I have to do more? It's very debilitating going through this. I can imagine.
It is, Arif. But I'll maybe expand our system boundary and say the following thing, right? First of all, as you said, high fees. These people are okay economically, one. Two, no one forces anyone to work in these, establishments. And I would much rather, as a society, and as a human being, an empathetic human being, worry about these poor people in a back alley, sitting with Uber Eats and Volt, shivering in the cold, rather than, young people overworking themselves in consulting companies for high fees. They made this choice, right? And it's fine.
I will disagree with you on this.
Okay, go
actually,
ahead.
Because
some action in our podcast.
No. This is important. This is more as part of the professor's research. What she actually identified, which I think makes this worse in some ways, is that these organizations actually deliberately set out to identify and recruit these type of people. So they knowingly,
what's strange about
they knowingly look for these insecure overachievers, right? And they use certain tactics to invite them and encourage and entice them into these organizations, right? So because of they know they're already insecure and they're looking for that validation, they don't feel very confident in their own capabilities, right? They know they're going to push themselves even further, right? So one firm, for example, described how they used tactics like, not tactics, slogans like, we're the best in the business because we want you to work for us. That makes you the best as well, right? So that kind of mentality. So it's like, oh yeah, I want to be the best, so I'm going to go there, because that's going to make me the best. Me working like them is going to make me even better. It's that kind of stuff. So it's interesting.
That's brilliant, Arif. No. I get your point. So you basically, and I'm not disagreeing with you, right? It's interesting how we got to a point, and there's an irony here, right? So we have just concluded, and there's logic to it, that these high achievers are now vulnerable. Which is an interesting thing. This is a mind bender for me. Right, we tend to feel. So I just painted the picture, and living in Putney, there's like a place that these poor souls gather that work in the gig economy, and I'm always looking at them, and
I agree with you.
Vulnerable people, right?
Of course.
But on the other hand, we say that some consulting and services companies, whatever you call them, are preying on the insecure high achievers, and it's like, well, that's the reality and the system we've constructed. That companies are preying on one kind of vulnerable and the other kind of vulnerable, right? Every vulnerability, unfortunately, is going to be preyed upon. If you're vulnerable to being addicted to mobile games, you're going to pay for these silly games that are Candy Crush, and so on. And that's what's going to happen. And I'm sorry to hear that. The question is, yeah, if we're talking about these, because we're not helping right now the gig economy poor people, but the insecure high achievers, what is it that we can tell them, if any of them is listening to our podcast, to help them in their vulnerable state, which I emphasize with them too, even though, they earn a lot, they wear nice suits and party a lot. But hey, vulnerability is vulnerability and suffering is suffering.
I get it. Yeah, you're right. What's eye-opening for me as well, going through this and doing the research and understanding all of this, is that it is much broader than I imagined too. So I'm like you, I'm in the same boat. It's fascinating. But what was interesting for me, and I'll answer your question about what do we do to help these people. Sure, we can go through that in a moment. But what was also interesting is that if you imagine from a leadership point of view, what does this mean? Obviously, if you imagine leaders going through these type of organizations, right, progressing in their careers, so by the time these insecure overachievers become execs themselves, they unconsciously basically replicate the same systems of control, right?
Man, yes,
and overworked that help create them. So it's like anyway. So that was that. I just wanted to finish on that point with that insight, because that is quite like I
mean, it's perfectly logical, but obviously very I think toxic. It's the irony here of all of it, right? How suffering creates suffering. We're getting into deeply ethical and really philosophical contexts in terms of how it all gets. But maybe just to maybe get to the point of Samsung, there's another avenue to explore, Arif, if we're exploring, which is these people are working 5 days a week. And maybe executives are a part of it, obviously, because they agreed to it, because they want to show that they're suffering economic hardship, and also they're suffering the hardship of having to stay long hours, right? The attractiveness of suffering and showing that you're emphasizing with everyone to create the sense of urgency. There's interesting stuff going on, actually.
Yeah, I was going to come back to Samsung as well. So, but let's go back to your earlier question: is how do we help these people, right? So, Professor Laura, as we've been talking about, she mentions a couple of things, right? And she says the first thing is, as a way of addressing some of this, recognize your own triggers. Right? So if you are in this position, or you recognize this phenomena that we've been talking about, you think, hold on, maybe some of that applies to me. Okay. And you could be a leader, because I mentioned it already before, that in her research, she's found senior leaders who have been facing this same phenomena. She talked about, for example, a director of HR at a leading accounting firm who she interviewed told her that, look, the head of our audit team is in the office regularly from 5:30 a.m. until 10 p.m., even on weekends. So is the managing partner, and none of that is exceptional. It's pretty standard behavior. So now, because everyone sees the execs doing it, they want to emulate it. So if you're, whoever you are, whatever level of the organization you are, if you're, feeling compelled to work longer hours, then maybe some of what we're talking about is something you want to listen to. So the first thing is recognize your triggers, right? Notice the ways in which you are being maybe manipulated, right, by your organization, in terms of how your behavior is being manipulated and how you respond, right? So notice which of your colleagues are particularly likely to make you feel more anxious through their comments and actions, and just be aware of that and be conscious of it. That's the first piece of advice the professor mentions.
Yeah, Riff. Okay, so I would possibly dispute like being tricked, because this is the culture that it is. Maybe, and I know that we have some other tips, but my tip in between the other tips is like, reflect if this is what you really want. If you're doing it consciously, that's fine. Right? But if that's the organization you want to work in, because if you do want to work in it, and if you find it's like you can take it and it brings you joy and happiness, hey, go ahead. Yeah.
And I think that it's funny, because she talks about some of this where she says, some of the people she spoke to, they want to do this, but in moderation, as in what she described was they want to please their clients, they want to please their customers, so they'll do extra work and all the rest of it because it makes them feel good. Excellent. And that's fine.
I mean, people run marathons, ultra marathons. It's like, why would anyone do that? But people like it.
But if it's debilitating in the way of there's this manipulative element to it, I think that's what we're talking about here.
Exploiting vulnerability, right? Yeah.
Now, the second thing she says is, I think this is very reasonable. Define success in your own terms and not others. And this is the whole point. Like if the whole validation aspect comes from, okay, I'm only successful if someone else tells me I'm successful. No, it's actually about, hold on, you are a perfectly rounded, capable, smart human being yourself. You don't need anyone else to tell you that. You know when you've been successful, right?
Yes, and you have to delete Twitter, Facebook, and
Instagram,
TikTok from your phone. Yes, all these wonderful definitions of success.
Yeah, no influencers. Too. Forget them.
No.
Yeah, that's it.
Definitely don't use that as the. But maybe ironic, but it's quite true because this is a plague. Like, oh my God, right? But it's a separate episode.
Yeah. And the final piece of advice she says is respect the evidence of and celebrate your success. So again,
that's always good.
So she says that once insecure overachievers achieve their goal, they tend to ignore it. Oh no, that's not good enough. I need to do something even more, right? And that's the typical, because it's like, well, I can't have been successful by doing that. I need more to do it. That's the whole reason they're called overachievers, right? But take the moment, pause, and recognize what you've done, and let yourself feel good about it. Let yourself feel like you've done something positive and you're proud of that. All right, and try not to think in that way of, okay, there is something else. No, just take the moment and pause and recognize what you've done.
Yeah, it's always worth it, wherever you are, whoever you are. Really reflecting on what you really are worth, which I'm sure, as one consultant once said to me, hey, the earth, the world is turning 24/7. So there's right things happening every time, every day.
No, exactly. So I suppose as we come to the end of today's episode together, I think from an agile leadership perspective, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what the responsibilities are on leaders when it comes to this whole phenomena that we've talked about, or the productivity discussion we had earlier on in the episode. Where do you see all of this from an agile leadership perspective?
My favorite quote: "Agile leader reflects," right? And in a way that, as a leader, if you're leading people, help them reflect if they're doing what they want to be doing, and if they're succeeding the way they want to be succeeding, and if it's a part of their life they want to have, right? Because obviously, if you're working long hours, even just 8 hours, it's a large part of your life. So that's important. Second of all, as a leader, you reflect yourself on your impact, which is another principle of agile leadership. What is the behavior you're modeling, right? If you're more senior, your beard is a bit longer, or your, your gray hair, whatever you represent your experience with, that's important too. And, this is a complex and complicated matter. We've just scratched the surface. But I think one thing that is maybe a retort to all this discussion about days and hours is, how do you contribute? What is it that you have the talent to do, and how are you adding value? And how can you measure it for yourself to see the great contribution you're making?
Amazing. Nice. That's a really good way of summarizing what we've been talking and thinking about. Thank you, TK.
TK special.
Yeah, definitely. And that's it for today's session. That's it for today's episode, I should say. Thank you for your great engagement and for listening in. And as always, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast and give us a review or a rating. It really helps us out with the algorithms. And until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.